Hello everyone! For this episode in Tarot of the Gods, I am doing another viewer request, which was requested quite early on in the series. It was requested by Jessica of The Journey of the Psyche, and she requested the Green Man. And this is a really interesting figure because the Green Man isn't really so much a deity as an archetype, really. His name gets kind of thrown around quite a lot in Wicca and in paganism in general. He gets equated with the horned god sometimes, or seen as a subset of the horned god. And I think, well, I think different mythologies sometimes get attributed to him as well, but he isn't in and of himself a part of any mythology or any pantheon, and there isn't really any particular evidence to show that he actually was ever considered to be a deity, or that his representations are inspired by any deity or or by any figure that was actually revered or worshipped in any sense. So the Green Man, where does the name come from? Essentially the Green Man is this type of picture or portrait or very often a carving in stone in a building, and that depicts a face, usually male, surrounded by leaves, and often sort of with leaves growing out of it, coming out of the nose, and often it seems as though the face is actually sort of in the leaves itself. It's as though the leaves are forming the face. And it is usually male. Sometimes you do see female or quite androgynous looking green men. But this is a trope that is quite common, I think, throughout the world, but particularly in Europe in general, and I think particularly in Britain and Ireland. But it's seen quite widespreadly throughout secular buildings and churches, and from, I think, sort of the early Christian period, I think is when we see the earliest examples of this, and right through to the 20th century. So I think it's most prevalent in churches, in the early kind of churches, and we're talking about the point at which there were still a lot of sort of gargoyles and grotesques and stuff like that. In the early churches there would often be animal heads and stuff like that carved into the stone, and very often we see green men as well. But the Green Man sort of seems to have hung on a lot more when it comes to churches, the architecture of churches, and the decoration in churches. And also just in general in sort of official buildings, like I think the Four Courts in Dublin has a Green Man on it somewhere, stuff like that. So it is something that has really kind of hung on a lot more than the other sort of examples of its type. So essentially I would consider the Green Man to be more of an archetype, like I said, than a deity, because while he doesn't necessarily have a set mythology attached to him, and he's not necessarily one particular deity, he is definitely a figure. It's something about the face and the image. It's so prevalent throughout, as like I said, I think throughout the world you do come across this sort of image. That I feel, and there is something very innate about him that you kind of get a feel for what he's all about even just looking at the image. You get this sort of innate sense of fertility and abundance and sort of the renewal of life and things like that. And I think for that reason people have associated him with the mythology of other deities, other vegetation deities, and deities that are associated with the agricultural cycle and stuff like that. So I felt that he lent himself very well to the Shadowscapes deck. I haven't used Shadowscapes yet for a Tarot of the Gods series, or episode I mean. And yeah, the Shadowscapes deck is quite opulent and rich, and sort of quite fantastical. There are a lot of mythological creatures and stuff like that, but it's also very nature based. There's a lot of particularly the Suit of Pentacles. It's very lush, and there's a lot of foliage and greenery and things like that, and it just lent itself very well to this figure. So yeah, first of all I'm going to talk about the King of Pentacles. Now this was the first card that came to mind for me when I thought about the Green Man, and it was this particular card from this particular deck. So something that is interesting about the Green Man is that he is in fact a man. A lot of the time when we see deities and mythological figures that are associated with the earth, and with life and growth and stuff like that, it's quite often female. We talk about Mother Earth and things like that, and that seems to be quite common throughout a lot of cultures. So it is interesting to see a male figure. I'm also often quite masculine. He often has a beard, and he really does look quite masculine. But to see, yeah, a male figure associated with that sort of sense of growth and fertility. So we are kind of looking at something that is slightly different to your typical sort of female fertility kind of symbolism. We're looking at male fertility, and it definitely has different connotations. So primarily I feel that we have a connotation of manifestation, and very active kind of manifestation, in a way that is associated often with the male, with the masculine, and with male archetypes, and indeed with the king archetype in general. So the King of Pentacles is really perfect archetype to represent this kind of feeling. The King of Pentacles is a very powerful figure for me. As you might know, if you've seen some of my videos on tarot, I actually came to tarot first through Shadowscapes. So this image here was the very first introduction I had to him. And it is a very powerful image of sort of abundance, and he has sort of arrived. He is in optimum strength, you know. He has manifested the fruits of his labour, and he is, yeah, at the height of his strength and power as an individual. But at the same time, I feel that he has this sense of sort of humility. He has this sense of generosity as well. There is a sense that he has manifested all this abundance, but he's not going to hold it all to himself. He is letting this abundance flow forth, which is very much the image that we see in the Green Man. Here he is shown as sort of being part of a tree, almost he is a tree, with his arms outstretched. Now the arms outstretched can be simply seen as the branches of the tree, but I also think there's a very Christ-like element to this image. So we get this connotation of a sacrifice, that the King of Pentacles is sort of, he has manifested all this abundance, but then he is willing to sacrifice himself back to the earth so that the cycle can continue, so that the cycle can renew. So yeah, this is a very powerful masculine figure for me, a very powerful archetype, and I think it's definitely an archetype that I turn to a lot, you know, when I need to get things done. When I'm in that state of feeling uncertain, or feeling hemmed in or kept back, or feeling under pressure and sort of stressed out by everything that needs to get done, because the King of Pentacles is very much in the seat of his own power. There is no sort of stress or anxiety involved with what he is trying to manifest. It's coming about very naturally, it's flowing out from him, and he's not getting too bogged down with what the results are, what's going to happen with the fruit of his labour, with what he has manifested. It's just this very natural cycle of sort of creativity and then yes, ultimately probably sacrifice, so that the cycle can sort of continue. So it's also reminding us that we need to release the fruits of our labour so that the cycle can continue. We need to constantly be willing to release what isn't working so that we can let the creative flow continue to do its job. So another card from the suit of Pentacles that I chose was the Ace of Pentacles, and we're kind of going along a similar kind of vein with this card. The Ace of Pentacles for me though is more about that initial spark of life. It's more about the underlying sense of life rather than the sort of physical manifestation of that life. We're looking at the seed, the core fertility of the Green Man. At the beginning of the video I mentioned the relationship between the Horned God and the Green Man. Now the Horned God is very often considered to be sort of just a name for the god of Wicca, or even just the god in paganism. And so therefore the Green Man might be considered to be a subset of the Horned God, an aspect of the Horned God, or just another name for the Horned God. The way I like to see it though is more that the Horned God and the Green Man are two sides of the same coin, and that they are actually balanced, and that they come together in a balanced way to represent the masculinity, the kind of masculine element of the earth and of nature as a whole. The horn god for me is associated with the hunt, with animals, and with death. He's sort of a very earthy, bloody kind of figure, a destructive figure who sort of draws things back to the earth, draws things back to death, so that they can be reborn again. Whereas the green man is very much associated with life, life-giving, renewal, and with plants rather than animals, and with vegetation and the plant life. So the reason I would associate the plant life with life more than animals, and that I would associate animals with death, is that animals feed off death a lot more than plants, whereas plants primarily feed off light and sun. Now obviously plants also feed off death in that they feed out of the soil, which contains other dead plants. But I definitely feel that there is this much stronger association with animals, with death and decay and the hunt and those sorts of things, because animals have they have much more need for consuming other forms of life in order to survive, as opposed to plants, which can live much more readily on a lot less energy, and like I say, primarily or at least quite often mostly on water and light. So I quite like that sort of understanding of the green man as being part of those two figures which combine to create this whole of nature. So the green man is this very sort of life-giving, let's just say associated with light rather than dark, and associated with life-giving rather than life-taking. A very important card in relation to the green man is the Wheel of Fortune, or as it's sometimes known, the Wheel. So the Wheel of Fortune can be seen as sort of a battle of wills and the fortune of humans and stuff like that. But very often it's also associated strongly with the Wheel of the Year and the coming and going of cycles, and this is the way that I like to mostly interpret it. So obviously the green man is associated with the cycle of the earth, with the cycle of plants producing and dying off, and with the sort of life-giving fertile aspect of that. Very often vegetation deities in mythology are strongly associated with the Wheel of the Year and with agriculture. So they will be called on to help the harvest, to help the crops grow, and to give their fertility to the land. But what I find interesting about the green man and those sort of vegetation type deities is that they're actually often, you could almost see them as being the underlying fertility and constant life underneath all that coming and going, underneath that Wheel of the Year, that it is sort of constant and always there, and that it is maybe the more feminine aspects of nature that come and go. So for example, in the story of Persephone or Kore, we see the female, that she descends to the underworld for the winter, and so the earth becomes barren. But there is often this corresponding male vegetation deity who is actually constant, and their fertility is always there, but they can't actually bring their fertility forth. They can't fertilize the earth without the presence of the female. And this is quite interesting because obviously males are sort of more constantly fertile than women. They don't have the same sort of cut-off point of menopause, and also they're sort of obviously women are, unless they're pregnant or breastfeeding or whatever, they generally ovulate once a month, so they are sort of capable of reproducing, or capable of becoming fertile once a month. But then once a woman is pregnant, obviously she can't become pregnant again until the child is born. So realistically, in a woman's life, she can generally only become pregnant about once a year. Whereas the man is always capable of spreading his seed. He's always capable of fertilizing. And I feel that this definitely comes into the mythology, where the male vegetation deity is sort of this sense of life and fertility that is kind of underlying and just constantly there beneath the surface. and he is sort of being asked to bring his fertility, to make sure that his fertility is present so that the earth does actually produce the crops that the humans need. But then it is the female deities that come and go, and it is their journey around the wheel that sort of causes this growth and decay. So that's an interesting way of looking at the Green Man as well, that he is sort of this evergreen figure. That he's not necessarily taking part in this cycle of life and death, and that perhaps he is just this constant of life, this underlying virility of our planet. And then lastly, I've chosen a card that has actually come up a couple of times now in the Tarot of the Gods, but it has a very, very different feeling in this deck than it does in, say, the Rider-Waite, and that is the Hierophant. Now, this card, I have to say, varies possibly more than any other card that I've noticed. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it varies hugely from deck to deck. I know a lot of people struggle with the Hierophant, but I actually have a very, very positive relationship with this card. So you can see why this card leapt to mind when I thought about the Green Man, because he's a bit like an ant, and he is literally this face in the midst of a tree, this sort of half man, half plant sort of creature, which is quite unusual for the Hierophant. The aspect of the Hierophant that I feel this most taps into is his sort of innate wisdom, and I think this has an interesting thing to say about the Green Man. The Green Man obviously is not only a personification of nature, but I feel that there is some sort of connotation of the meeting of human and plant, and the meeting of nature and humanity, and the meeting of the sort of unconscious, symbolic kind of physicality of nature, as opposed to human beings' consciousness and intellect and self-awareness. And the Hierophant in this regard sort of taps us into our innate kind of physical knowing. We all have our intuition, we all have all this unconscious information that we take in all the time that doesn't get processed by the conscious mind. There's all this stuff going on in there that just doesn't make it into the front parts of our mind, which are dealing with language and conscious thinking and logical thought and all that kind of thing. There's all this other information and knowing that goes on in the background, and I feel that this card, this version of the Hierophant, really taps us into that. It really reminds us of the power of that kind of knowing, and the importance of tapping into nature for that reason. I think this is one of the reasons that being in the wild is so powerful to humans. It reminds us that we're not in control of everything, you know, that there's so much not only outside of us but even within us that we can't consciously control. We can't consciously control most of our being. We can't consciously control most of our mind, most of our psyche, even most of our body. So I think, yeah, that the Green Man as the Hierophant reminds us of this wildness and this trueness, this true knowledge that lies within us all, and that we need to tap into in order to really know ourselves, in order to really understand our place in the world and that kind of thing. It reminds us, and it's funny because quite often the Hierophant in other decks is very much associated with the other kind of knowing, with the intellect and logic and reasoning and that kind of thing, and mysteries of the conscious mind and stuff like that. But he's also often associated with a symbol of the key, and I feel that definitely also taps in, even in the more ascetic versions of the Hierophant. That symbol of the key, which is so common in most decks, also reminds us of that need to go within for knowledge and wisdom and sacredness as well. And the Hierophant is obviously associated with the sacred and with spiritual understanding. And I think that the Green Man definitely reminds us to remember how to connect with the divine in a physical way, and reminds us of the immanence of the divine and that sort of thing, if that's your cup of tea. So yeah, delving into the Green Man was a really interesting experience because he is a bit complex, because he's not, is he a deity, is he not a deity, he's such an all-encompassing figure, but I definitely really enjoyed getting to grips with him, and I thought that the Shadowscapes deck really captured his essence. So I might actually do the Horned God at some point, because I feel like he makes a very nice counterpart to the Green Man. I haven't decided which deity I'm going to do next time around. I might pick one that I just want to do myself, because I thought that I might do requests every second episode and that I might just pick my own. I'm really dying to do Kali actually, so I might do her next, and then after that I will pick up where I left off with the requests. So keep the requests coming. I think it's really interesting for me as well as for everyone else to do requests rather than just picking the deities myself, because it challenges me. It makes me think about deities that I wouldn't ordinarily think about, and that definitely sort of opens up my mind to alternative understandings of mythology and of the divine and all sorts of things, all sorts of great things like that. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that, guys, and I will be talking to you again soon. Take care.